In the spring of 1953, a hydrologist named Carl Bauer climbed down a rope ladder into a test boring at a depth of 340 feet in the Libyan desert, 60 miles south of the coastal road between Tripoli and Benghazi, and found himself standing in water, not damp sand, not moisture-saturated sediment, standing water. The boring had been drilled as part of a British Petroleum survey assessing subsurface conditions for potential oil extraction infrastructure. Bauer was not looking for water. He had been sent to assess rock density and permeability at depth. He spent 40 minutes in the boring recording measurements and taking samples, and when he surfaced he wrote a single sentence in his field log before any other notation. The water is moving. Moving water at 340 feet below the Sahara, 60 miles from any surface water source, flowing in a direction that his compass and the boring's orientation told him was running not toward the coast but away from it, south, into the interior of the continent, away from the Mediterranean, away from every drainage gradient that the surface topography of the region would suggest. Bauer submitted his field log to the survey's chief geologist that evening. The chief geologist reviewed the water notation, marked it as outside the scope of the survey's mandate, and instructed Bauer to confine his subsequent reports to the rock density and permeability data he had been sent to collect. Bauer's field log, including the water notation and the directional observation, was filed with the survey's internal records. It was not included in the report submitted to British Petroleum. The BP report described the test boring results in terms of rock formation and structural suitability. It did not mention water. Bauer's field log surfaced in 2001 when BP's archive of pre-nationalisation Libyan survey materials was partially released to researchers following an agreement with the Libyan government. A hydrogeologist at the University of Rome named Francesco Testa found it while reviewing the archive for a study on North African subsurface water systems. Testa noted the directional observation in a footnote of his 2003 published paper. The footnote describes Bauer's notation as consistent with the anomalous flow directionality that his own study had identified in aquifer data from the same region. It does not elaborate. It is a footnote. The paper's main text does not discuss it. Testa was asked about the footnote in a conference in Naples in 2004 and stated that he had included it because he felt it should be on the record somewhere, and that the conference on subsurface water systems was not the venue for the larger conversation it implied. He did not specify what that larger conversation was. The footnote remains the only published reference to Bauer's directional observation in any scientific literature. Before we go further, if investigations like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what moving water beneath the Sahara flowing in the wrong direction means, and why the official hydrological record of North Africa has spent 70 years finding ways not to address it directly, we have to start with what is actually known about water beneath the Sahara, and how different that knowledge is from the public picture of a dry, dead desert with nothing beneath it. The Sahara is not a waterless place. Beneath the sand spread across an area larger than the continental United States lies a network of aquifer systems holding an estimated 150 cubic miles of groundwater. The largest of these systems, the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, stretches beneath Egypt, Sudan, Chad, and Libya in a continuous body that contains more fresh water than flows through every river in North Africa in 1,000 years of surface flow combined. This is not contested. It is documented, mapped, and cited by hydrologists, governments, and international water agencies. Libya has been drawing on it since the 1980s through the Great Man-Made River Project, a network of pipelines that moves fossil groundwater from desert aquifers to coastal cities. Egypt draws on it for agricultural irrigation in the Western Desert. The water is real, it is vast, and it has been there accumulating for longer than the desert above it has been dry. The scale of what is beneath the Sahara is difficult to hold in the mind. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer alone is larger in surface area than the European Union. The water it holds was not deposited recently. In the regions where it has been tested, it has been sitting underground for tens of thousands of years. insulated from the surface climate by hundreds of feet of rock, maintaining a temperature and pressure that have kept it largely unchanged since it was deposited. Governments drawing on it for irrigation and drinking water are not using a renewable resource. They are mining a deposit that accumulated over geological time and that, once drawn down, will not refill on any timescale relevant to human civilization. Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and Chad are collectively extracting from an aquifer whose total recharge rate in the current climate is functionally zero. The water being pumped up today was deposited when the Sahara was wet, and the picture of when the Sahara was wet, how wet it was, and how its water systems functioned during those periods is considerably more complicated than the standard account acknowledges. What is less publicly discussed is where the water originally came from, how old it is, and what the spatial distribution of pressure and flow within the aquifer system reveals about the history of the landscape above it. The official answer to when the water was deposited is simple: during the African humid period, the era between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, when the Sahara was a green, wet landscape supporting large animal populations, human settlements, and substantial surface water systems. That wet period ended, the climate shifted, the surface dried, and the water that had infiltrated the ground remained trapped in the permeable sandstone layers below, preserved by the impermeable layers above. This explanation is accurate for a significant portion of the aquifer water. It is not accurate for all of it. Radiocarbon dating and isotopic analysis of water samples from the deepest portions of the Nubian sandstone aquifer have produced age estimates that considerably exceed the African humid period. Water at depth in portions of the aquifer has been dated to between 40,000 and 80,000 years ago, water that was deposited during a wet period that predates the last glacial maximum and that corresponds to a climatic phase that the official paleoclimatic record for North Africa treats as insufficiently documented to characterize with confidence. Water that old at those depths was not deposited during the African humid period. It was deposited during a period of wet conditions in the Sahara that the official record acknowledges imperfectly and describes incompletely. That is the age of the water. The direction it flows is a separate problem. The Nubian sandstone aquifer is generally described in hydrological literature as a static or near-static body, fossil water that infiltrated the ground thousands of years ago and has remained essentially in place since the surface dried. The movement of water within the aquifer is described as minimal, driven by small pressure gradients that produce flow rates measured in meters per year rather than kilometers. This is the picture that the public-facing hydrogeological literature presents: ancient water, mostly still, slowly depleting as extraction draws it down. The pressure gradient data from the aquifer does not consistently support this picture. A Sudanese hydrogeologist named Ibrahim Wad Madani, who spent 12 years between 1978 and 1990 conducting aquifer pressure surveys in the eastern Sahara for the Sudanese Ministry of Water Resources, compiled a dataset of pressure measurements from 847 boreholes across a region covering approximately 400,000 square kilometers of the aquifer's eastern extent. Madani's analysis of that dataset, submitted as a technical report to the ministry in 1991, identified a consistent pressure gradient running from northeast to southwest across the study area, a gradient that implied active water movement in a direction and at a rate substantially greater than the static model predicted. The movement his data suggested was not meters per year, it was kilometers per decade, and its direction, northeast to southwest, away from the Nile Valley into the interior of the continent, ran contrary to every surface drainage gradient in the region and contrary to the direction that the standard depositional model for the aquifer would predict water to move. Madani's 1991 technical report was submitted to the Sudanese Ministry of Water Resources. He had spent 12 years on this data, 847 boreholes across 400,000 square kilometers. The pressure gradient he identified was not a marginal finding from a handful of anomalous measurements. It was a pattern consistent across the majority of his data set, appearing in boreholes distributed across the full geographic extent of his study area. A pressure gradient that consistent across that many independent measurement points is not a statistical artifact. It is a physical reality. Something beneath the Eastern Sahara is maintaining a pressure differential that drives water movement at rates and in a direction that the standard model of the aquifer does not predict. What is maintaining that differential, whether it is a geological structure, a thermal gradient, an active recharge source, or something else, is a question that Madani's report identified and that no subsequent published study has formally addressed. It was filed. It was not published. It was not cited in any international hydrogeological study of the Nubian sandstone aquifer published. In the following decade, Madani presented his findings at a regional water conference in Khartoum in 1993. A summary of his presentation was included in the conference proceedings. The summary notes his pressure gradient findings and his directional conclusion. It notes that the findings were described by attendees as requiring further investigation. No further investigation was published. A German hydrogeologist named Werner Schaefer, working for a UNESCO technical assistance program in Chad in the early 1980s, encountered similar pressure anomalies in the Western Sahara aquifer system during a survey of borehole data from the Lake Chad Basin region. Schaefer's UNESCO project report, filed in 1984, includes a technical appendix describing pressure measurements from boreholes in northeastern Chad that indicated water movement in a direction inconsistent with the local topographic gradient. Schaefer's report was filed with UNESCO's Technical Assistance Archive. The main body of the report, dealing with water resource assessments for agricultural development, was cited in subsequent UNESCO publications. The technical appendix containing the pressure anomaly data was not cited in any subsequent publication. It is available in the UNESCO archive to qualified researchers. It has not been cited in the peer-reviewed hydrological literature on Saharan aquifer systems. There is a third independent line of evidence: satellite radar imagery, beginning with the shuttle imaging radar missions of 1981 and 1984, revealed beneath the surface sand of the Eastern Sahara a network of ancient riverbeds, paleocanals, running across an area of approximately 1 million square kilometers. These paleochannels were not small features. Some of them are comparable in width to the Nile. They document a period when the Sahara was crossed by major river systems, flowing with volumes of water that the current landscape gives no indication of. The official interpretation of these channels is that they date to the African humid period and represent the rivers that flowed when the Sahara was green. Some of them do. But the directional analysis of the paleochannel network as a whole, the overall drainage pattern implied by the orientations of the channels and their tributary relationships, does not resolve into the simple coastal drainage picture that the African humid period model predicts. Some of the major paleochannel systems run inland, away from the coast, away from the Nile, into the interior of the continent, toward the same regions where Bauer found moving water in 1953, where Madani found anomalous pressure gradients in the 1980s, and where Schaefer noted directional inconsistencies in the 1984 UNESCO data. The 1981 and 1984 shuttle imaging radar missions were not designed to find ancient rivers. They were geological survey missions designed to assess surface and near-surface structure across a range of terrains. The discovery of the paleochannel network beneath the Eastern Sahara was a byproduct, one of several unexpected findings from a mission whose results exceeded its original scope. The research team that published the paleochannel findings in 1982, led by a geologist named John Macaulay at the USGS, described the discovery as evidence for a dramatically wetter past in the Eastern Sahara, recommended systematic study of the channel network's full extent and directional patterns. That systematic study was partially conducted. The portions that were published documented the channels consistent with the African humid period model. The portions of the directional analysis that produced results inconsistent with that model appeared in technical appendices and conference presentations rather than in the main body of published work. Macaulay noted in a 1985 interview with a science journalist that the full channel network was more complex than the published work suggested, and that understanding it completely would require more survey missions and more detailed directional analysis than had yet been done. The additional survey missions were not funded. The detailed directional analysis was not conducted. The complexity Macaulay described in 1985 remains, in the published literature, as a footnote to a finding whose main conclusion was settled in 1982. 3 independent lines of evidence: a British petroleum field log from 1953, a Sudanese ministry technical report from 1991, a UNESCO project appendix from 1984, each produced by a credentialed researcher working within an institutional framework, each describing the same thing: water beneath the Sahara moving in a direction that the standard model of the region's hydrology does not account for, each filed, acknowledged, and not published, each sitting in an archive where it is technically accessible and functionally invisible. The international hydrological community has never published a formal study directly addressing the directional anomalies in Saharan aquifer pressure, data identified by Madani and independently noted by Schaefer. It has never explained why the paleochannel network revealed by satellite radar, which includes major channels running inland rather than toward the coast, has not produced a published reanalysis of the standard African humid period drainage model for North Africa. It has never produced a published response to the age data from deep aquifer samples that dates the water to periods predating the African humid period, water whose presence the standard depositional model does not predict and whose origin the standard model has not explained. Why does a region containing 150,000 cubic miles of groundwater, studied by dozens of international research programs over 70 years, not have a published study formally addressing the directional anomalies that 3 independent researchers, working in 3 separate decades, identified in its pressure gradient data? Why are the specific sections of the BP field log, the Sudanese ministry report, and the UNESCO technical appendix that describe directional anomalies each confined to footnotes, appendices, and conference summaries, the portions of the scientific record that are present but not emphasized, cited but not discussed, available but not accessible to any reader who is not specifically looking for them? Why does Karl Bauer's 1953 observation that the water was moving, a 4-word notation in a field log filed with a petroleum company's internal archive, remain 70 years later the most direct primary source description of anomalous directional water movement beneath the Sahara that has ever reached any form of published record? These questions do not go away because the official hydrological literature on North Africa is extensive, credentialed, and institutionally authoritative. Extensive, credentialed, and institutionally authoritative literature can contain systematic gaps. The systematic absence of direct published engagement with anomalous directional data from 3 independent sources across 3 decades in one of the most studied arid regions on Earth is not the product of oversight. It is the product of a research community that has collectively decided, through the accumulation of individual publication decisions, that this particular question is not one it is prepared to answer in print. The water is still moving beneath the Sahara. Bauer's boring is sealed. Madani's pressure gradient data is in the Sudanese Ministry Archive. Schaefer's appendix is in the UNESCO Technical Library. The paleochannels are still visible in satellite imagery running inland toward the interior of a continent that the official record says has been dry for 5,000 years. The official history tells us the Sahara's subsurface water is ancient, mostly static, and fully explained by the wet period that ended 5 millennia ago. What the field logs, the technical reports, and the radar imagery tell us is that the water beneath the world's largest desert is moving in directions the official model cannot account for, was deposited during periods the official timeline cannot fully explain, and has been described as anomalous by independent researchers whose anomalous findings have been consistently confined to the portions of the scientific record that nobody reads. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the anomalous Paleochannel network beneath the eastern Sahara to a 1969 joint survey conducted by the United States Geological Survey and the Egyptian Geological Survey, a survey whose published findings described the channel network as consistent with standard African humid period drainage. The unpublished internal working documents from that survey, a portion of which were released under a FOIA request in 2008, describe the channel orientations in terms the published version does not use, terms that match exactly what the satellite radar missions found 15 years later, and that the 1969 survey team had already seen and chosen not to publish.